a friend of mine recently flew into Montreal airport, and the plane was delayed, and there was delays on the ground and so on. So we got to his hotel quite late, and he was a little bit worried because there were certain necessities he needed to get. But across the street from the hotel was a convenience store with big, neon light, open 24 hours. Felt a lot better about that. So after checking in, he went across the street to get what he needed, and he got to the door, and the manager of the store was just locking up. And he said, I'm sorry, but there's certain necessities I need to buy here. And he says, oh, well, it's 11 o'clock. He said, we always close at 11. And so my friend said, yeah, but the sign on the window says open 24 hours. And the manager looked at him and said, not in a row. Now, I sometimes think that gives us an illustration of what's happened with regard to America's defense industrial base, that it is in many ways not what for years or decades it was advertised as, that there was this wonderful machine that had been set up that started World War II, culminated in factories like this one, Wacoom's plant in Fort Worth that manufactures the F-35, that there was just sort of this constant outpouring of everything that our military needed, everything we needed to fight and to deal with peer and near-peer competitors anywhere in the world, and that machine would always be available and always be ready on demand when required. And of course, what we found out is it's not what had been advertised. That it turns out that our defense industrial base in so many areas is lacking a lot of resources and is in many ways in crisis. Even, I'll tell you this coming from Washington, D.C., even Congress has gotten that message and are trying to figure out what to do and where to go with this. And what all of you represent and what this whole program that Chris has put together represent, reimagining defense industrial base in all the different sectors for all of the services. And one important way in which I think we can do this is by going back all the way to the beginning and to where that defense industrial base in land, sea, and air, and now in space, all have their origin. And I think the better we understand where it came from and the principles on which that was built from the start, the most successful industrial base ever during World War II, that can provide us with some insight into how we want to build that base going forward. And here, I think we need to set aside again what's been advertised as how that defense industrial base came about, right? And the way it's usually portrayed in documentaries and in textbooks and so on is that on that day of infamy in December 7th, 1941, bombs drop on Pearl Harbor, and then almost overnight, America's industrial base shifted over to making all of the war material that was necessary to fight not just one world war, really, but two world wars, one in Europe and then one in the Pacific. And that this sort of shift simply took place almost automatically. Well, what my book is about, and what I'm going to talk to you about today, is about what really happened and how that transformation really took place. And in order to do that, we got to take you back to the real start, which is not Pearl Harbor, but the summer of 1940. The summer of 1940, when President Roosevelt and his advisors realized that the world was changing in ways that were going to catch up with the United States very, very quickly. That in that summer of 1940, at a time when Germany is overrunning France and threatening Britain and has an army that looks like this, the U.S. Army that same summer looks like this. Next slide. Where was that? This is the real vehicle. This is what was called the belly flopper. And it was the light utility vehicle. This is the prototype. that was set up for the U.S. Army here. And you can see it has one advantage, and that is low profile. That works out. But there's a lot of other things that are missing with a military vehicle of this kind. And Roosevelt realized that the United States was going to be in very, very poor shape if the war began to expand onto our shores. Now, I have to say, the one service that was at least brought up to modern standards in 1940 was the U.S. Navy. It did have the capital ships that were able to at least compete with and were comparable to those of the other of the great European powers, as well as the Asian power, Imperial Japan. But of course, what will happen is with Pearl Harbor is that the most important assets of that Navy would all be sunk. It would all be at the bottom of the harbor as a result of that. And that this was a Navy, U.S. Navy, however advanced in terms of its platforms, like carriers and battleships, that it was also a Navy that had global commitments that far outstripped its available resources. Sound familiar? For the other services, however, they were in far worse shape. The United States in 1940 had the 18th largest military army in the world. Hungary had a bigger army than we did. Brazil had a bigger army. Netherlands had a bigger army than we did. And as France falls and as Britain threatens to fall, Roosevelt's Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, tells him, he says, if Hitler were to land 7 divisions on the East Coast, there's nothing we could do to stop him. He could run right up through the middle of the country. We had no way of stopping him, preventing this from happening. And Roosevelt realized something had to change. If the war did come to our shores, this was one in which the United States was going to have to go almost from a standing start to become a modern mechanized military in order to face these foes, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. The question was how to do it. Well, what my book explains is that what he did, next slide, was he reached out to private industry. And he made a phone call to this man whose bust is at the National Defense University. And when I give a speech there every year, graduating class and so on, they trot out Bill Knudsen's bust. Bill Knudsen was CEO of General Motors, and Roosevelt called him and said, I need help. Can you find a way in which we can mobilize America's industrial base in such a way that we'll be able to, create a military that is ready to face a foe like Nazi Germany or perhaps Imperial Japan if it comes to that? And he said, a lot of my advisors here are telling me the way to do this is to nationalize industries, to find ways in which Washington can direct and coordinate all the sorts of resources that are necessary in terms of material, in terms of supply chains, in terms of facilities in order to do that. And Knudsen said, you don't have to do that. He said, let me talk to my colleagues and to the executives at the major automobile companies, which was the dominant industry in the United States at the time. Let me talk to Ford. Let me talk to Chrysler. Let me talk to Packard. Let me talk to GE and to AT&T and all of the companies in between and down the scale. He said, let us figure out how to do this. And I will guarantee you that in 18 months, you'll have more military material coming out that you'll know what to do with. Give me 18 months in which I'll do that. And that's in fact what happened. In those 18 months that Knudsen and his colleagues were able to literally retool American industry to produce war materiel on this kind of scale, was the secret to how America was able to not only arm itself for victory in World War II, but also arm its allies. That 2/3 of all of the material used, military equipment used by the Allies in World War II was made right here in the United States. And when you look back on it and look back on what was achieved from 1941 through 1945, the numbers they're still staggering. what they were able to achieve. Think about it, that American industry in that period of time was able to turn out 141 aircraft carriers, 206 submarines, 800 surface vessels for the Navy, 8 battleships. We're talking serious battleships, like the New Jersey parked over here in Philadelphia yards. Was able to turn out 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 2.6 million machine guns, and 41 billion, that's billion with a B, rounds of ammunition. In those 5 years, by 1944, American shipyards were turning out 8 aircraft carriers a month. I gave that statistic at a talk I was doing for Huntington Ingalls Leadership Summit. You should have seen their heads explode. They thought about what that would look like and how that was achieved here. We were turning out a warplane every 5 minutes, right? And 8 merchant ships a day were coming out of America's shipyards during that period of time. All of this made possible by what this man and his colleagues were able to set in motion in terms of retooling and re-engaging America's industrial base for a new kind of task. In many cases, as you'll see, to do things that many companies had never done before. And that's how it was done. This was the way what Knudsen had realized, and he explained to Roosevelt that what Roosevelt was really tapping in with the American industrial base was an ability to outproduce anything that the Axis powers were able to produce. That the quantity would overwhelm our opponents, who at that time, the Germans and the Japanese, especially, for example, in the air, had superior aircraft. There was no doubt about that. They had air supremacy in the theaters in which they were operating here. But that America could outproduce them in numbers that would that would save democracy. And that's why Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy in December of 1940, because he realized Knudsen and his colleagues were onto a good thing, that something really exciting and tremendous was happening by turning loose the energy and drive of private industry to achieve public ends. And how you did that is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time with you. So I'm going to talk about, there's really 6 principles but I'm going to talk about 4 today that underlay how the United States was able to build that military second to none during World War II at an industrial base like no other in history, and what those principles are and how they apply not just to the our current defense industrial base, but also, I think, in many ways to the whole issue of productivity, the whole issue of innovation within the corporate world as a whole. Principle number 1. What Bill Knudsen did was you seek out the most productive. Go and find the companies that are the most productive. Even if they've never done it before, they'll figure out a way in which to do it. They'll figure out how to achieve that here. And this is precisely what he did. Next slide. He went to colleagues like Henry Ford, to his colleagues in the automobile industry, and also everybody else that he knew in the supply chains, the vast supply chains that the automobile industry had all across the country, and said to them, I need your help to manufacture what's needed in order to build our American military. The automobile companies, you're going to help me build aircraft engines, for example. And in fact, ultimately, to actually build entire aircraft. Ford, General Motors, had never done anything like this before, taking designs by America's leading aircraft designers and then figure out a way in which to produce them. But of course, that's precisely what they did. That's precisely what they were able to achieve in doing this. Because he understood, and he always knew, well, go to the big companies because they're the ones with the largest engineering departments. And those engineers will figure out a way in which to carry out and to do things that are going to be new and going to be different from anything that anyone else has done before. Next slide. And one of the first companies he went to, because he knew them from his GM time, one of the first companies he went to was Saginaw Steering Gear. which made, well, steering gears for automobiles. And he went to them in the fall of 1940 and said, we need machine guns, 30 caliber machine guns. Here's the design. This is a Browning 30 caliber machine gun. Here's some samples that they had packed up in crates of what the machines looked like. And he brought the Saginaw steering gear executives and engineers in and said, can you make these things? We said, yeah, I think we can probably do that. We never made a machine gun before, but yeah, this looks like something we can figure out. And they signed a contract to deliver by March of 1942 to deliver 2,800 30 caliber machine guns based on the Browning design. And Saginaw steering gear came through. And in March 1942, they delivered not 2,800 machine guns, but 28,000. Because those engineers had figured out in the process of mass producing these things that they could design it better and find ways in which to save time so they could produce more and more of these things. Little basic kinds of things, like, for example, on the barrel, for the cooling of the machine gun, the holes that were drilled there. With the original Browning models, these were always ovals. And so the Saginaw engineers came back to Knudsen and he said, why are they oval? And he said, that's just the way in which Browning's done it. They've done it for years this way. He said, it could be a lot faster if we just make them round. Go ahead, make them round. And the result was, of course, saving minutes, even hours in terms of production with these things. And this is the story you get over and over and over again, is how once you got these companies involved, that they produced not only far more than were expected, but could keep on growing exponentially from there. Once you turned loose the principles of flexible mass production, anything was possible in any kind of an area with any kind of war material that you needed here. But there's also, I think, another lesson that goes with this story here. And that is that what happens is when you turn to the most productive, that you also get innovation, right? And in many ways, particularly at the Pentagon and particularly in Congress, innovation is thought of as a separate category. Everybody there at the Pentagon, we need more innovation. I've been working for the last 2 years with this commission on Pentagon budget and looking for ways in which you become more flexible to move at the speed of innovation, as if innovation was this sort of separate, again, category that's out there. It's not. What makes innovation possible and feasible is when you bring in those who understand how to produce the most and how to do it most cheaply. Another great example of this, another automobile company, this was Pontiac, when they were licensed to produce the 20-millimeter Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun, the 20-millimeter anti-aircraft gun. And this was a Swiss design. The engineers took a look at it, and they said, we could build this a lot faster. This is like, handcrafted, the original design with it. And so the Pontiac engineers turned the 20-millimeter gun from something that was produced one every 4 to 5 hours to producing one every 15 minutes. And the result is that the anti-aircraft batteries, and Hudson, by the way, did the same thing with the 40-millimeter Bofors gun as well, learning how to mass produce them in numbers. And that when Navy ships, for example, confronted the threat of kamikaze attacks in the Pacific, one of the things that saved ships from destruction and kept the death toll from kamikaze attacks from being as terrible as it was, kept it from being even more catastrophic, was that these ships were festooned with 20-millimeter and 40-millimeter anti-aircraft guns, all made possible by the power of mass production that went with it as part of this design of outproduce the Axis to save democracy. Next slide. Here's your second principle. Now, the graph is going to be kind of hard to see back there, but I'll just summarize it real quick. Focus on results, not process. Right? We have a Pentagon now that's obsessed with process. It's not obsessed. It needs to be with results. And that's, in World War II, the Navy and War departments had no choice. Their backs were to the wall. They had to do this fast. They sort of turned companies loose, let them do what has to be done. This is what we need. You figure out how to do it and do it fastest, quickest. And this is what happens with one area after another. And on the graph, which you can't see, I've got tanks, I've got aircraft engines and artillery, and there the graph from 1941 through 1945 goes steadily upward. And yet, if you were to look closely at that graph, one of the things that you would notice is that in every category of growth in terms of war material, in 1944, starting in 1944, the numbers drop off. And the reason is that by the summer of 1944, once they had turned this machine loose, American industry loose on these problems, how to produce as much as cheaply and as quickly as possible, that the real problem was going to be how to shut this thing down. And so by the summer of 1944, you go to the trade journals for industry through that period, through that summer, the big discussion is about T-Day. No, not D-Day, not the landings at Normandy, but Termination Day, of how to get companies now to terminate their contracts so that they could go back to producing for the civilian economy again and figuring out ways in which to make that kind of thing happen. Next slide. Now, probably the great example of this focus on results, not process, from a maritime standpoint, was the production of the Liberty ships. The Liberty ships, which became the freighters that carry war material on both sides, but particularly across the Atlantic during the World War II. This was a design that was originally drawn up for the Brits. The American shipyards, particularly those which were being under construction by Henry Kaiser on the West Coast, but then also on the East Coast, these freighters were originally a design that was for a ship that could carry as much stuff across the Atlantic as possible, and then maybe make it back. When the Liberty ships, 1941, 1942, as they start coming out of the slips, the German U-boat warfare is at its height. And it was assumed from the very beginning that these ships were not going to make it back to the United States. These ships were on a one-way trip. And so they were designed that way, as simply and as straightforwardly as possible, with as little electrical gear as was necessary in order to run the ship, to have concrete poured floors on the decks here. It was a throwaway design, is basically what the Liberty ship was. But in the course of the war, they manufactured about 2,700 of these things. In the course of the war, what happened is that, again, through the process of mass production of these things, where they even got it down that they could produce a Liberty ship one a day in the process here, that in the process they brought in innovations that made it more and more seaworthy and made it more and more a ship that would not be ready not just for a one-way trip, but would last and persist. And in fact, the losses during the war, about 200 were sunk in the course of the war. But the rest, after the war, became the great surplus maritime fleet for the United States all the way through. And the basic design that was originally a throwaway design, next slide, proved to be so resilient and proved to be so seaworthy that, in fact, even by 1990, there was still a fleet of Liberty ships in the James River Reserve Fleet. There they are, all parked, ready to go if on call in the process here, too. And in fact, even today, to 2024, there are still 2 Liberty ships that are at sea, carrying gear and carrying freight at this time here. Not bad for a throwaway design, for one that was supposed to be throw it. But again, it's because the focus was on results. We need these ships. We need them as many as possible. But the people then who were turned loose on that problem found ways to make them, in a sense, models for future ship design. And in fact, the approach that Kaiser and his team brought to the production of the Liberty ships, it's all in my book, the process that they brought to the discussion, the modular of putting these together, not building from the keel up, but snapping them together like Legos with different components and so on, became the basis for the maritime shipbuilding industry in the post-war Japan and South Korea. They said, oh, that's a really good approach to how to build ships in that precisely that way. And it would be what would make those countries leaders in maritime shipbuilding after World War II. Next slide. The third principle, after seek out the most productive, right? Focus on results, not process. The third principle is think it forward. And that is that once you got these companies involved in getting government contracts to produce and develop, that in one example after another, they began to think about not just how do we fulfill this government contract, but what comes next. What comes next for us, not just in terms of a government contract, but also in terms of what comes next for us as a result of the work that we're doing and what we're achieving here for the sake of the government. And the best example I can come up with is thinking it forward is the story of the Jeep. By the way, this is not in the book. So this is for you guys. The Jeep. In the summer of 1940, the War Department, the Army, decided that maybe they needed to do something better than the belly flopper as a light utility vehicle. And so they came up with, as the Army will tend to do, a list of requirements and specifications to go with it. The vehicle, the replacement vehicle would have to be a four-wheel drive. It would have to be tough enough to deal with all kinds of different terrains. And it also had to be light enough that 6 guys could pick it up and turn it around 180 degrees. Because the things got stuck. You wanted to have something that would be able to be sort of dug out of the mud or dug out of a ditch and be able to pick up and moved here too. So that was the basic specifications. The Army sent off 246 RFPs. Exactly 2 companies answered. None of the major automobile companies wanted to be involved at all because they didn't want to work with the government. They knew it was time-consuming. They knew it would be costly. Even if you built a prototype, you'd have to pay for it. Government was going to pay for a prototype. That wasn't going to happen here as well. And it was just a waste of time. All that red tape, all that bureaucracy. We're talking about the 1930s, right? Companies simply didn't want to deal with it in any kind of way. Only 2 companies answered. One of them was Bantam. Bantam was really in a company that worked in farm machinery and agricultural vehicles here, but they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And the head of Bantam was like, it's the last throw. You know, what do we got to lose? We just might as well put in for this contract here and see what happens with all of that. And in fact, Bantam hired a really good freelance automobile designer, a guy by the name of Karl Probst. And they went to him and they said, can you come up? We have no idea what we're doing. Can you come up with a design that would sort of fit with what they're looking for, this automobile? And Probst said, yeah. And in fact, in 48 hours, he came up with a design that was good enough that the Army said, yeah, we could work with this. This is something that could work. The other company was Willis Overland. And Willis was run by a automobile designer. Probst, as I say, was a very fine designer. But Barney Roos, R-O-O-S, Barney Roos was a designer genius. Now, Roos in the 1930s had spent a lot of time in Europe working with automobile companies there, Fiat, for example. And what he had noticed was that in Europe, there was this enormous market for small cars, that people were very content to buy cars that would just get them from one point to another, that weren't, these chrome-encrusted, large, car, a Buick, the Cadillac, the Packard here. They just wanted a machine that would take them from one place to another and back. And so he felt very much that there was an untapped small car market in the United States that no automobile companies had reached for. But that maybe by getting the contract for the Army's light utility vehicle, for its general purpose vehicle, as it was called, the GP or Jeep, you could get that contract. That could be the step to opening up that commercial market. So he put in, those are the 2 companies that put in, and in fact, the models that they came up with were good enough that the Army said, we can't choose between them. We'll have a drive-off, which is what they did. And it was an epic, the story of what those two companies did in competing with each other, particularly to beat the weight specifications. They were doing things like at Bantam, they would thin out the paint so that the paint would weigh less as they put it down. What Barney Roos did with his team at Willis is they took out every bolt and shaved off a 1/4 inch at the end in order to, again, to beat the weight requirements. But the key for Roos is that his engine, the engine that he had, his engine for the Jeep, was made out of aluminum parts, and that was the decisive factor in the course of it. Willis got the contract. Knudsen said, what we'll do is we'll take the contract. Willis gets the contract, but so will Bantam. Bantam can now produce, because they're all ready to go, they can produce for the Willis design in their own factory. And then for the mass production of these things, they turned to Ford and turned the Ford assembly plants loose on the Jeep. And what's interesting is that the Ford designers, when they got the Willis design and so on, the Ford engineers said, we can't improve on this. This is really great. In fact, the only thing that Ford added to the Jeep design was an extra 2 slots in the front grille. The front grille of the Jeep, the trademark front grille, right? The Willis one had 7. Ford added 2 more. But it's the Ford mass production numbers that made the Jeep the power that it was. Next slide. And made it possible to produce 500,000 of these things in the course of the war and outfit not just the U.S. Army, but the British Army, the Red Army. These are Soviet Jeeps that you see here, carried across, of course, on Liberty ships, right, to the port of Murmansk in the course of this here, and it made it the ubiquitous vehicle, again, not just for U.S. forces, but for Allied forces around the world. And for Roos, his design would live on, right? I mean, think about it. Is there any other automobile design which has basic design that has persisted for 70 years, the way the Jeep has, right? It was all because Roos felt that it was possible that Americans would buy a car that would just be something that would take them from one point to another. And out of that came then a new way of thinking about automobiles, a new way of thinking about what happened from there. Next slide. Now, thinking forward works in 2 ways. One is a conscious thinking forward. Now I'm going to tell you a story about the thinking it forward that came through by, if you like, almost serendipitously. And that's the story of this company, Rock-Ola, based in Chicago, Illinois. They were a jukebox company. They were the regional jukebox company. And when the War Department was advertising for companies to come produce M1 carbines, the head of Rock-Ola said, we could do that. We could convert our lines from making jukeboxes to making M1 carbines. And so he did. And Rock-Ola did. They produced M1 carbines right down to the end of the war. Here, for those of you who are gun enthusiasts and so on, the Rock-Ola M1 carbine is a collector's item. It comes with a high premium, as with all the companies that were brought in with it. U.S. Postage Meter, for example, Postal Meter, they produced them. The typewriter company, Remington, they produced them. Any number of companies that shifted over from making a civilian product to making a wartime product. Then, when the war ended, Rock-Ola went back to making jukeboxes. But guess what? They had learned certain techniques, certain innovative manufacturing breakthroughs as a result of the work that they had done on the M1. And so when they went back to making the civilian product, Rock-Ola made a jukebox which was not only better than the pre-war model, but was cheaper. And it was more, it could handle more discs and do more for listeners. And the result is that Rock-Ola, after the war, went from being a regional company to becoming a nationwide and able to compete with the giant in jukebox industry, which was Wurlitzer. And so the Rockola machines like this one, after the war in the 1950s, are spread all across the country. Every diner, every restaurant, in garages, every place now you see run into a Rockola. And, of course, the music that they would play on these things, the hit tunes for the 1950s that came out of it. And that's why it's called rock and roll. Rock and roll is a corruption of Rockola, because that was the jukebox that was associated with the music coming out of Little Richard and Elvis Presley and the other artists who were part of this whole thing. I bet you didn't know that, did you? See, aren't you glad you came to this conference? The kinds of historical facts that you're able to pick up as a result of coming here and being here this morning. So again, it's the contract becomes a stepping stone. In Roos's case, a stepping stone consciously forward. In the case of Rockola, we just learned a lot about how to make our own product by working on the government contract in the process. Next slide. The fourth principle I'm going to talk about this morning in our time remaining is share the glory. Now, this is a photograph. This is a photograph from the Wichita plant, the Boeing Wichita plant that produced B-29s during the war. And this is the ceremony that surrounded the completion of the B-29 there on the right, which was the 1,000th to come out of the Wichita plant here. And for this landmark event, they assembled, as you can see here, you've got the grandstand that's set up, you've got the honored speakers, you've got the executives, etc. You've got a band which is there to play. And then all around the ceremony are the thousands of employees from Boeing who were part of that process, who were part of the making of that aircraft, and who are made as feel part. You are part of the effort that's underway here, of how we are bringing victory not just to the United States, but to the free world. And that when you look through the records, when you look at what happened in the course of that World War II mass production machine that was turned loose through industry, and one company after another, big emphasis on the part of the executives is that we are all part of a common effort. We are all involved in this together, and we're all committed together to achieve and to reach the kind of excellence that's going to be needed to make a victory possible. Next slide. This is at the Bethpage plant of Grumman Aircraft. The man standing on the box there is Roy Grumman's business partner, Jake Swerble. This is a weekly event that took place at the Grumman plant where Jake would get up and read to them all the latest news about the production numbers of what was happening and what was taking place. You can see all the workers now gathered around here listening in on what the production numbers are looking at. The latest E for Excellence Award. Knutson introduced this, by the way, as a way in which to reward companies that hit their numbers or produced at a level of excellence that required government recognition. And they would proudly fly the E for Excellence banner from the masthead at the plant and the facility or the shipyard that went with it. So every week, Swerble and the workers get together to talk about what's coming, what they've accomplished, and what's coming next here. And Grumman was a great example of this kind of binding common effort. Roy and Jake office, they had partner's desk that they sat at, and the door was always open. Anybody could go in to see Roy Grumman to talk about what was happening at the plant, what was taking place, to come in and say, you know what, we've got a bottleneck problem here. Or I think there's something we could do with some of the machine tools, move them to a different place. We could speed up process and get things done here as well. Or visitors would come by. For example, combat pilots, guys who had been flying the Grumman Wildcat, the F-4F in the Pacific, would come back and say, I got to see Roy. And they come into the office. There's no secretary. There's nobody to check it. They come in and say, I want to thank you for saving my life because we're outclassed by the Japanese Zero. But you've built this wonderful iron brace behind the pilot's seat here. And that saved my life. It saves my colleagues' lives in the process. But you know what else you could do, Roy? And Roy would say, well, he said, we're a little underpowered. Do you think you could find a way in which to bring in an engine that gave us a little more power, a little bit more maneuverability in terms of our ability to fight against the Japanese Zero? And so Roy listened. And the next model, the F6F Hellcat, would be built around the Pratt & Whitney 2800 double wasp engine, much more powerful than the 2600 that had been used on the Wildcat. In fact, it was the first example of an aircraft that is literally built around the engine. Roy went to his engineers and said, that's the engine we're going to use. Build a plane that'll carry it as a fighter plane. And they did. And it was the most successful fighter, except for the Corsair, certainly the most successful carrier-based fighter during World War II. The other thing that they did, too, the other thing that Grumman that was characteristic of the Grumman company was the little green trucks. I don't know if you've ever heard about the little green trucks. Little green trucks would go out to employees' houses or go out and fix problems and issues that had come up for employees so that people could get to work on time. You're driving to work, right? You're driving to work, right, on the Long Island Expressway. You have a flat tire, right? So you go to make a call, and they'll send out a green truck. And the guys will come out, fix the flat so you can get to work on time here. You get up in the morning, hot water heaters, the basement's flooded with a foot of water I can't come into work, we've got the flood. They would send out the little green truck. And two guys would come out, replace they say, you go into work, we'll fix the hot water heater. I can't go into work today. True example. I can't go into work today. The kids are coming home from school early, and I've got to be here to meet them. Because don't forget, about 40% of Grumman's workforce were women, right, who would come on to work for the first time in assembly line work. No problem. They'd send out one of the guys to green, and he meets the kids when they come home from work, right, here, and prepares the little snacks for them and everything else. That was Grumman. That was that building of that kind of bond between employer and employee, because it was important not just for the morale of the company, it was important for the mission that they were trying to accomplish and what they had to achieve, because the nation's freedom, the free world, depended on having those workers at work and doing their job and doing it in the best possible way. Next slide. And of course, when the war came, by the time war came, every worker, every employee in these plants, in these facilities, all realize how vital what they are doing in building the ships and making the planes, the aircraft engines, the M1 carbines, how important that is, because their families are on the line now, right? You're working in a plant, right? As your the job working at the Packard plant, or working at the Studebaker plant, right, making trucks, and you know that the safety of your husband, your brother, your uncle depends on the work that you're doing and what's taking place here. And that awareness of how the war had now become a personal mission, and winning war was now a personal mission, really comes home to you when you read about the accounts of the Rosie the Riveters and their connection and their sense of how important what they were doing was. And the most extraordinary example I found was a letter written by a woman who was working in the Richmond shipyards, building Liberty ships, as a matter of fact. And her husband was a Marine in the Southwest Pacific. And she writes a letter, it was 1944, she writes a letter to her husband. And she says, I like to think that I am building with my own hands the ship that will bring you home. It's lovely, isn't it? That's the kind of connection that you had. And in the aircraft plants, too, you talk to the Rosie Rivers, and they all knew that what they were doing right? The rivets that they would put in on the B-24 or on the B-26, that those rivets had to be precise, no margin for error, because these planes, have aluminum skins which tear easily, and so the rivet in the wrong place, a weld that's not complete here could mean catastrophe in the air. And your husband, your son, the person next to you's husband or son could die if he didn't get that exact right here too. That binding force of employer-employee, of mission and employee, is one of the keys to the success of that industrial machine which is turned out. Next slide. And it's going to last. It lasts down to today. In 2012, the second B-29 to be refurbished for airborne service, dock, took to the air. The second one here. There was a huge ceremony out at Wichita, Kansas, because that's where it had been produced, where dock had been produced. And so they brought together ladies like this one on the left, who had actually worked on the assembly line for the B-29s at Wichita. And this woman in particular, she had worked on dock, and there was her plane. And she could tell, right, we're talking 2012, we're talking 60 years later, she could go and point to exactly where on that plane she had put in the rivets, right? On the front nose, and then on the wings here. She knew exactly, could remember exactly where it was that she had worked on this thing here. That sense of pride lasting 60 years for being connected and bound with that. That's what that fourth principle, along with seek out the productive, focus on results, not process, think it forward, share the glory. Next slide. Now, I have a personal story to tell you here at the end with regard to Freedom's Forge, and that has to do with what happened during COVID. And I got a call from someone who told me, he said, "Oh, by the way, Operation Warp Speed, to mass produce vaccines, the COVID vaccines, they're telling reporters at the New York Times that one of the inspirations for them was your book, Freedom's Forge." And I said, "Really? I did not know that." So I was on the National Security Council at the time, so I called the head of Operation Warp Speed, General Perna. Next slide. There he is. I called him and said, "I understand that you've been looking at Freedom's Forge as a guide to the production and what you're engaged in there." He said, "Come on over." So I went over to DHS, to Health and Human Services, not DHS, HHS, went over to their building and got to meet Perna. And he said, I knew your book when I was head of Army Materiel Command, and it was recommended to me by a certain chairman of the Joint Chiefs who said, "You got to read that book." And so he said, "I did." And it had a big impact on how I worked as head of AMC. And the day before I was supposed to retire, I got a call from the White House, said, "You're not retiring yet. You're going to be heading up this program that we need to produce 12 million COVID vaccines by December, basically in about a 4-month window." And he said the first thing I did was to pull down the copy of Freedom's Forge from the shelf and open it up. And he said that was my guide to figuring out how I was going to do this. And he said the key was it was for him and his team to think about COVID vaccines not as a healthcare issue or even a medicine issue, but as a mass production issue. That's what was really engaged in. And that the principles of mass production, flexible mass production I talk about in the book, was precisely what was going to be needed in order to generate vaccines at the scale and with speed with which they were going to be needed here as well. So Perna was great, and he introduced me to the members of his team. They asked me to speak on the command floor. You got the next slide? Did I leave that slide up? Yeah, there it is. That's the command floor for Operation Warp Speed. They asked me to come to speak because everybody knew that This had been the way in which to think about their task in a fundamentally different way. And that was the key. They were, if you like, reimagining, right, vaccine production as an issue of mass production, as a manufacturing issue, first and foremost in the process. Next slide. And it all goes back to the same principle, the one that I had from the button that I had also found in the store from World War II era, which was that the key advantage was to outproduce the Axis in World War II, right? That the arsenal of democracy was the result of applying what the private sector already knew about how to be productive and innovative and bring it to bear full scale to the issue of how America was going to arm itself and win this war. And I think those are principles that can be as powerful and as useful now in thinking about how we do go about revivifying and reimagining our defense industrial base as they were in the summer of 1940, when Bill Knudsen got that call from President Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, "What the hell are we going to do? How are we going to win this war?" I'm done.
Thanks.